All right, well, I want to thank you all for coming to this session on dead zones. We are here in New Orleans, and we are at the near the mouth of the continent's largest river. And this brings for us a lot of benefits, and it brings for us some problems. It brings for us benefits. We have enormous resources of water. We almost never have to worry about a drought. Happens every now and then, but we rarely have to worry about water rationing. We have the incredible ability to facilitate and conduct commerce across the rest of the country. We are at an ecosystem. The river has produced a vast ecosystem that produces everything from fisheries, shrimp, biodiversity. So great resources here. But it's an area that is also, and the environmental history of this area also brings with it some problems. The Mississippi River is no longer as contaminant-free as it used to be, and that is a major issue. One particular contaminant is nutrients that are in the river that, when they reach the Gulf of Mexico, feed large algae blooms, which, when they die, cause hypoxia. This is a major problem of national and in some senses global importance. It has everything it could impact our fisheries, it can impact the way we live, and many of these issues will be discussed today. It's an issue that we have known about for the last 30 years or so, but I think, as some of the speakers will tell you, we have not seen the level of improvements in the size of the dead zone that many people would like. We have three speakers today. One represents the Hypoxia Working Group, another is an agricultural economist, and the third is with USDA. We'll have all these speakers speak, and the first one of those will be Doug Daigle, who is at the Department of Oceanography and Coastal Sciences at LSU, who received his master's, interestingly, in environmental ethics at the Colorado State. So with that, Doug, please take it away.
All right, thank you. I see a lot of young faces in the audience. This is an issue that's been around for a long time, so some of the older folks may think that there's nothing new to say about it, but there are some new things that have happened, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm speaking for a group called the Louisiana Hypoxia Working Group, which I organized back in 2003 after the completion of the Hypoxia Action Plan, which you'll hear about. And we've been meeting every month since then, believe it or not, mostly in Baton Rouge. And this is a group that mainly is a forum now for agencies and stakeholders. Initially was the forum for coordinating people in Louisiana to work on this issue. We have a little more marginal role now, but we're going to talk about what's happened with this phenomenon and the policy response and the legal basis for what's going on now, all these years later, since the effort initially got started. It's a phenomenon that we understand what's causing it. We know where the nutrients up in the Mississippi River Basin are coming from. There's a good several decades of solid science behind it. And down here in this dynamic coastal system we have in Louisiana, this zone that forms on an annual basis is still one of the largest in the world, generally second largest. We have a very dynamic system here. This is the continental shelf. The Mississippi and the Chaffalaya rivers empty into the Gulf. They're not going into a bay or a lake to form this large zone, and yet we still have this large area of low oxygen that forms because of that nutrient loading. So it shows that this is a pretty striking phenomenon that's been happening, and it's one that we had hoped to get fixed by now, or at least show a lot of improvement. Now, there are two federal laws that have played a pivotal role in the national response to this problem. One is the Clean Water Act, and back in 1995, a group of environmental organizations went to what was then the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, is now Earth Justice, asking them to petition EPA to convene an interstate water conference. We're privileged to have one of the people in the audience, Bob Weigel, who was involved with that
yes,
all those years ago.
Wish I remembered more about it.
Yeah. But that started the national response, and I won't go through all the steps that happened, but in that time, which was during the Clinton administration, you had a White House-level response to this problem. They put together an interagency working group, and they convened through the Office of Science and Technology The Committee on Environment and Natural Resources brought in experts of scientists, economists, agronomists to do a series of reports, which was to inform the federal and national response to this problem. And in 1997, a task force was formed with the federal agencies, and they were bringing in the states along the Mississippi River Basin, or along the Mississippi River, to participate in the effort. Some of them were brought in kicking and screaming, but they were brought to the table. The other law that played a pivotal role is the Harmful Algal Bloom and Hypoxia Research and Control Act, or HABARCA, which is the acronym. And the first version of that was passed in 1998. It was called the Breaux-Snow Act at that time, because those were the two main Senate co-sponsors of the bill, Senator John Breaux from Louisiana and Olympia Snowe from Maine. Section 404 of that law is the one that was specifically looking at Gulf of Mexico hypoxia, and they required an integrated assessment of science to be put together. That happened, and they also called for an action plan. And they wanted it to be completed in 2000. It wasn't totally done then, but it was largely done, and this was the first action plan. 2001, it was submitted to Congress on the last day of the Clinton administration. And then not much happened for a while, but the process has actually continued since then. So that task force has continued to operate since that happened. And it's, it's stayed pretty consistent what it was trying to do. You'll hear a little more about this, but the size of the hypoxic zone fluctuates every year, but the trend has been one of growth. And the goal is to get it down to a 5-year running average size of 5,000 square kilometers, which is about 1,950 square miles. That was the goal set in 2001 action plan, and the goal has not changed, but what happened was not exactly what was anticipated. So by the year 2008 comes along, some reassessment is going on because this task force has been meeting, and that 5,000 square kilometer goal was supposed to be reached by the year 2015. In 2001, it was 2000, 2001, that was 15 years away. It seemed like a lot of time, and it was. But 2008 happened, and people realized, well, we're halfway there, and we're obviously not we're kind of worried about where we are in terms of reaching that goal. So a decision was made to keep the goal, and I put the actual wording up here because from that 2001 plan, the first phrase there turned out to be very significant, subject to the availability of additional resources. Well, what do available or additional resources mean? I mean, there's two kinds of resources. There are resources that are available because they're there, and you go get them or try to get them. There are resources that someone may give to you, and they become available that way. The task force really didn't do either one. It was supposed to be working on an integrated federal budget that never was put together. In the year 2007, I was at the meeting where the representatives from EPA, then in the Bush administration, openly told us that they were not going to fund the action plan, which I said it would have been nice if you told us that, 7 years ago. But anyway, this plan remained in effect. And just to break up the monotony of the slides with nothing but words, there's the cover of the 2008 version. So in 2008, the plan reaffirmed the goal that it had. But the decision that was made then and continued to be made, which particularly frustrated me, was that if you're not, that if you don't get additional resources, you're not going to make the goal. And you know that if you don't try sufficiently to get those resources, de facto you have decided that you're not going to make the goal, but you don't want to come out and say you're not going to make the goal because, that doesn't sound good. But the advantage of the plan was that it brought together all those states and the federal agencies who were mandated to deal with the problem in a collaborative framework. Relationships were formed, a lot of diplomacy from an initial situation that was very contentious. So there has been value delivered. The 2008 goal, as I mentioned, kept the same size and the date. They were working from a science advisory report in 2007 to EPA that said, based on what they could tell, a 45% reduction of nitrogen and phosphorus was what was needed to reach that goal, and that would be a 45% reduction in the loading to the Gulf of Mexico from the Mississippi and Atchafalaya rivers. That SAB report, along with the other things I'm citing, is still online. There was a key change, though, in the 2008 version of the plan. The first version in 2001 set up something, or called for the setting up of something they call sub-basin committees. And I helped set up the first one down here in the lower Mississippi River. And I've got a subsequent slide which shows you the sub-basins in the river, larger Mississippi River Basin. It's a little misleading because the lower Mississippi really includes coastal Louisiana, southern Louisiana. So these are the sub-basins. The first plan called for, whoops, I was trying to reverse it. How do I do that, Lizzie? I want to go backwards.
Oh, you can post the back arrow.
Where's that? Oh, okay, I see it. Never mind. It's showing how, okay. So the first version called for sub-basin committees to form their nutrient reduction strategies. 2008, they changed that to state nutrient reduction strategies, a different approach. Each state was supposed to come up with its own strategy to reduce nutrient loading to the Mississippi River. The plan said to be completed as soon as possible, no later than 2013. They actually all finished them in 2015. A couple of the states actually did get them done on time, but generally they all got them finished in 2015. But it was already apparent before 2015 that goal of reducing the 5-year running average of the hypoxic zone was not going to be met by 2015. So they saw that coming. So what to do? Well, there were a couple of problems with the state strategies. There were no common benchmarks. The EPA and Inspector General did a report in 2013 where they pointed out, in addition to running late, most of these plants don't have definite goals or targets. They weren't required to have that. Now, one of the advantages of that is that it gives a lot of flexibility to the states. No one knows how much every state would need to reduce nutrients. Obviously, some states load a lot more than others. Iowa is the largest loader, Illinois, Indiana, the Corn Belt. Louisiana is one of the smallest. So no one could really tell every state how much they needed to reduce, but there was a common commitment that they were going to reduce nutrients. So that was never really addressed. They also didn't say how they were going to fund them. The whole effort started with a federal commitment to get resources to the states. As I mentioned, that was effectively dropped at some point, but they never picked it up again, so no one has said how these plans, which there are different stages in every one of the states, would be funded. Now, some states have come up with money on their own, and I've listed 3 there that either through state tax programs that they have or through legislative bills have actually raised money to implement their state strategies. And Iowa's legislature actually passed a couple of bills, one for like $20 million, which, considering that they weren't required to do that, was impressive. It's a small portion of what it'll cost to reduce their load substantially, but they've taken that step. Louisiana has not. Missouri and Minnesota each had state tax programs, conservation taxes in Missouri and a clean water tax that passed in Minnesota, and they applied funds from those taxes to their state strategies. That didn't happen here yet either. But our state came up with a strategy, like the other ones did. In 2013 was largely when in 2014 was when it was coming together, and quite frankly, our state strategy was not a big help for the effort. The first thing they did, for reasons I'm still not clear on, is that they didn't want to call it a nutrient reduction strategy. They named it a nutrient management strategy. Now, it's maybe implicit in if you're achieving reductions of nutrients, it's going to involve management of agriculture and practices and all that. But the states had all committed in the action plan to have nutrient reduction strategies. And even though they didn't have common benchmarks, that basic commitment was there. When Louisiana did that, they basically risked undermining the whole effort, because if other states had said, well, wait a minute, Louisiana's saying it's going to be nutrient management, we'll say that too. It could have basically upended the whole effort, or if you want to call it, nullified this plan, which was cooperative and non-binding, and yet basically involved commitments that the parties had made, and the state which actually had the dead zone or hypoxic zone affecting it was basically, undermining its own commitment to this. If other states had done that, it could have been a big problem. Fortunately, They all just kind of ignored it, and they stuck to the commitment they had to come up with nutrient reduction strategies. The particulars of our state strategy, which is also online, and you can look at it, involve things that are, certainly helpful. They're ongoing agricultural management programs, DEQ watershed programs. Basically what's being done already. But the centerpiece of it was supposed to be coastal restoration projects, diversions from the river. We have a few of those operating now. There's a number of them in the state master plan for the coast, but they haven't been built yet, and we're not sure when they're going to be built. So the ultimate role they play in this, as far as hypoxia goes, is highly uncertain right now. I mean, we still don't know when the next freshwater diversion that the state's planning will be started. We don't know when it'll be finished. So it's kind of hard to say what role that would play in the strategy. The master plan calls for them all to be finished by 2060. So assuming that all worked out as planned, it wouldn't be until 2060 that they had their total impact. So, it wasn't really clear how much that would contribute to helping things. And the other thing, of course, was that, like most of the other strategies, Louisiana's was completed before the task force decided what to do about the 2015 situation when they revised the action plan. So it's not geared to help meet what happened in 2015, which you'll hear about. Now here's the basic situation going back to the beginning of the measurements in 1985 that the Louisiana University's Marine Consortium carried out under the leadership of Dr. Nancy Rabelais. The trend is one of growth, although it's highly variable year to year, depending on what the river flow discharge is. If you have a drought, it tends to be smaller. If you have a big flood, it tends to be bigger. Nothing surprising about that. This shows you where the goals aim is, the 5,000 square kilometers, and it shows you what the average has been over 5 years now. So there's still a lot of work to be done. And so 2015 rolled around, and this is another representation of the size of the zone every year in terms of kilometers and miles, which is helpful to see. And it gives you some averages down here on the lower right that are helpful to see the goal, what it calls for. 30-year average there is substantially above. The 5-year average is higher above. So, again, still a lot of work to do. Yes?
What happened in '88?
In '88, they didn't have funding. So there was some measurement that happened, but they couldn't do the annual cruise. So the ND stands for no data.
No, that's '89.
Oh, '89, okay. '88 was the record drought on the Mississippi. Yeah, that was the year the river basically dried up in places like Memphis. And, so that was a record drought that happened. I'm sorry, you said '88 and I looked at '89. Yeah. And then 2011, it was still pretty big. The next year you had a drought, not as extreme as 1988, but you can see it shrank. This was striking in terms of the climate trends we're experiencing, because here you had the record flood of 2011. The next year you had a pretty serious drought the very next year. The interesting thing this shows, too, is that when you look at those two, it shows that if we reduce the nutrient inputs, there will be a response. So in this case, the response happened because the river's discharge shrank substantially, but the zone shrank too. So that shows you that there will be a response. It won't happen that quickly because this was pretty extreme in terms of what was happening with the river, but it shows that the system will respond when the inputs are reduced. So I won't go into this in detail other than to say, as I mentioned, there was never the level of investment that was planned initially from the federal level. And until 2009, when the U.S. Department of Agriculture started an initiative that Scott Edwards is going to talk about, there was not a lot of direct funding sent to deal with the problem. 3 minutes, boy, okay. I'll skip some other things, but come to 2015. So what to do in 2015? I was part of those discussions, even though most of my recommendations weren't followed. People were saying, well, maybe we should just drop the goal. Maybe we should keep a goal but drop the date. You say, we're going to reach this goal, but there won't be any particular date that we do it. And a lot of them would have probably liked to do that, but it wasn't credible because public trust is not at a very high level. And so they realized that if they did that, it would basically erode, remaining credibility that they had. So the decision was made to keep the size. Then the question was, well, what date to set on it? And because of the uncertainties about funding, in particular, they wanted to have a 20-year extension to reach the goal. It's not to say we couldn't do it before then, but they did say something that is significant, which is that it will require significant commitment of resources to greatly accelerate implementation of actions. So unlike the earlier kind of passive wording saying subject to additional resources, this is pointing out that if they don't get significant additional resources, they won't make the goal. And then they set this interim target of a 20% reduction, sorry about the typo there, of nitrogen and phosphorus loading by 2025. That's step one. And even though that's not the strongest target they might have set, it is significant because they're all supposed to be working at this point to reach that goal. And here we are in 2016, so the first year has gone by already. If that's not reached, then you know that this target is, the overall goal is not going to be reached either. So it's a kind of conditional approach to this. I'd wanted it to be phased in 5-year increments, maybe try for 10% in 5 years. USGS and some folks felt that that wasn't really feasible. But this is this interim target is the milestone. If that isn't reached by 2025, then you know you're not going to reach the overall goal. If it is reached, and it could be exceeded, I had wanted to say at least 20%, but you could overshoot and it wouldn't hurt anything. If it is reached, then you do have a shot at reaching the overall goal. And there's different components to it. You're going to hear about a couple of these from the other speakers. Scott Edwards is going to talk about the federal programs, and John Wester is going to talk about some partnership and research parts of this framework that was put together. And the framework was meant, again, to contain things that would be necessary but not necessarily sufficient to reach the goal. And if things were done under each of these categories within these time frames, then the goal could be met. If they aren't done, then we know we're not going to make it. And funding is a critical part of it because if we don't get additional funding, we know we're not going to make it, just as in 2008, it was very clear that if they didn't get additional funding, they weren't going to make the 2015 goal. There are different ways to do it. The Restore Act, final regulations from Treasury, changed some language which had restricted any actions being done within the coastal zone. Now you can do some things outside of the coastal zone. So in northern Louisiana and northern Mississippi, we can actually do some work related to this that we couldn't have done under the previous wording of the Restore Act. It's not going to be a lot of money. Most of it's obviously going to go to coastal projects, but it is an option we didn't have before. So hopefully that was all fairly coherent in talking about where we are today. And the other two speakers, again, are going to talk about some major components of this framework of this revised action plan.
Thank you so much for that talk, Doug. That was a great talk, a great set on the background of the dead zone. Our next speaker is Dr. John Wester. John got his PhD from the University of Minnesota, and after that he came down here to Louisiana. He's a professor of agricultural economics at LSU, and this is certainly an issue that has a major economic implications, and John will talk to us about them.
All right, thanks. Well, I'm going to talk about some things related to the issues that Doug raised about hypoxia, and I appreciate him setting the stage so I don't have to have a repeat of all those graphs. Usually when you go to a meeting about hypoxia, you've got every presenter has half a dozen slides showing the area and the contribution and all that, and I've avoided that, and I actually don't have any pictures either, so I hope this doesn't put you to sleep. But what I'm going to talk about is this, is Doug and I have been working on this here in Louisiana for a long time. I started going to those hypoxia working group meetings when I first started here, and it's hard to believe. That's kind of how I track my time in Louisiana, is how long I've known Doug Daigle and gone to the hypoxia working group meetings. And the thing is that over that time, there's been a lot of things that have happened, as Doug mentioned. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be any response in the river and in the Gulf of Mexico in terms of reduction in nutrient and the size of the dead zone. So what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is an effort by the land-grant universities in the Mississippi River Basin to try and have some kind of a coordinated effort to look at research-based, science-based practices to help land managers, basically farmers, address their contribution to the nutrient load in the Mississippi River and in those states that are represented. I'll talk about that in a minute. And it's kind of a collaboration between land-grant university scientists and members of the Hypoxia Task Force to try and get some movement toward addressing some of these goals to try and get 20% by 2025 and 45% by 2050 or whenever the heck it is. So I'm going to talk about the group that's actually was actually formed. It's a SARA group, which is a extension and research activities committee, and SARA just is because it's in the southern region. There's other regions of the country that have other agglomerations of state research universities. SARAs are basically groups of land-grant university research scientists. So in Louisiana, that's basically Louisiana State University, and I'm one of the two representatives for LSU on this committee. There's some other states, I'll show those up in a minute, and it's basically the land-grant university in each one of those states. They have 2 or 3 research scientists or extension specialists that work on them. And basically, these are formed to help collaboration among the scientists in those states address a common problem or common set of problems. And in this particular case, all of the research scientists in those states are looking at nutrient management from agricultural systems in either freshwater or marine systems that get into and cause hypoxia. All right? And so the overall goal of our group is to basically try to implement science-based approaches to address these problems. Okay. So these are the states involved, and if I had a map up here like Doug did of the Mississippi River Basin, these essentially are the states that are along the main stem, and then the Ohio, which are the major contributors to nutrients in the river, with I guess the exception of Louisiana, since we don't contribute a lot to that load, but we're definitely interested because, as Doug said, the hypoxic zone or the dead zone is right in our back door, our backyard. So there's basically 3 overall objectives to this group, this SARA group, and I'll talk about them in a minute in terms of priorities, in terms of how those mesh with things that the Hypoxia Task Force is trying to achieve. So basically what we're trying to do is this. We're trying to look at increasing and strengthening relationships or network between the different member states of this, the researchers, as well as the agency personnel in the Hypoxia Task Force. So we're trying to get even better communication because it's critical that when we're coming up with, through experimentation and monitoring and validation of models and activities, practices on the landscape, getting that information back to the Hypoxia Task Force members so that they can see, hey, this is a set of activities, of practices that has benefit that help reduce nutrient loading into rivers and streams that then get into the Mississippi. Maybe you should try these in your state and come up with policies or programs in your state that encourage the adoption of these practices in your state. Okay, so that's part of that, networking, and then also using collaborations that develop through these multi-state projects between the research scientists so that you get a kind of ground truthing of practices in more than one area as well. So that's what the second objective is to try practices in Louisiana, Mississippi that might be applicable up in Arkansas, Missouri, Illinois, and so forth, and vice versa. Okay, and then the last part here, the last objective is to increase exchange of information. Okay? Between all of those members as well as farmers, which are the main target audience for these research-based activities. Okay? So I'm going to talk about each one of those three objectives. There's basically a priority area, a broad priority area of collaboration that we're trying to develop between the land-grant universities and the Hypoxia Task Force members with the overall goal of reaching the goals of the Hypoxia Action Plan. Okay, so strengthening networks, the number at the top of that, or at the front of that, each one of those bullet points represents that particular priority area. And these, the ones that I've listed here, are the main priority areas for the SARA 46 group in terms of strengthening collaborations and strengthening networks within the member universities and the Hypoxia Task Force agency personnel. Okay? And one of the things that's important I wanted to point out is, you know, as Doug mentioned, one of the critical things that's missing in a lot of this is funding. And so one of the priority areas that the SARA 46 has is to coordinate our efforts in terms of research and outreach or extension to secure funding to help us and the task force essentially achieve some of these objectives that we have in terms of overall objectives of reducing nutrients in the Mississippi River Basin. And so what we're trying to do is use existing funding sources, both federal and state, and coming up with research ideas that can be that can get funding and that address these issues with respect to nutrient reduction for sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen. Okay? And a main part of that is strengthening networks between the member universities and the member agency personnel. Okay? And it's actually through initiatives and efforts like the Louisiana Hypoxia Working Group, where you get a chance to meet with individuals at the state level or the federal level, and those federal partners who have state representatives like Scott, who will be talking after me, and finding what their priorities are and what interests they have, and then working with them to get some of those practices on the ground and the funding to help implement those practices within each one of those states. And then at our meetings, which we have quarterly, we communicate that with the other member states, the other university partners, to let them know, this is what we're doing in our state. You might want to try that and develop those kind of relationships in your state as well. Okay? Second overall priority area that we have deals with research and outreach activities related to conservation practices or land management practices that reduce nutrients, phosphorus, and nitrogen. And one of the things, and then number 2 is the second priority. I'm going to talk about this one in particular, the one in yellow there that highlighted under number 6, and that's basically what we're trying to do there is look at developing social indicators, doing a baseline analysis of the level of understanding and awareness of individuals, producers, agency personnel with respect to the severity of these problems and the impact that certain kinds of activities might have on reducing those, so that we can get a handle on what is the understanding and awareness of the level of these issues, and then what can we do to help address them. And I'll get to some specifics of that in a minute. Okay? and just some other conservation practices. One of the things that we've highlighted is this number 10 here. I don't know how familiar many of you are with the fact that most farmers nowadays get a lot of information from experts that they work with on their farming operation. So they use them as a source for information on what kinds of management practices to utilize on their farm, including conservation practices. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is work with certified crop advisors, who are those experts that give producers information and suggestions on how to manage your farming operation. So working with them, these CCAs, to help them be an agent to help get that information to them. So we, as research scientists at the different land-grant universities, get information about what works and how effective certain practices are in terms of reducing nutrients. Then we work through workshops with CCAs to help them understand the effectiveness of these practices, so that when they, who have access to a lot more farmers than we do, go out and work with the producers that they're working with, they can convey that information to them. And I don't know how many of you were in the session earlier, the previous session dealing with climate change and attitudes. This is what we're looking at in terms of like a delegate, a super delegate, somebody that they have, or voucher, somebody that they have confidence and they trust this person. So if we work with them to help get that information to them, we can affect change on the landscape a lot more quickly than if we, as an individual, are trying to do this ourselves, or just put out one more scientific report that most people aren't going to read. Okay, so this is another way that we're trying to bring about change on the landscape. Okay, and then of course, we wouldn't be scientists if we weren't trying to monitor and validate these specific activities and find out how effective they are, both within our state and other states that are in the Mississippi Atchafalaya River Basin. Okay, so those are some of the, I just listed some of the overall collaborative priorities. What exactly we're doing right now? Well, I wanted to focus, since I've almost got about, 5-6 minutes left? So I'm going to just skip down to this one in the yellow here, the social indicators group, of which I'm a part of, and one of the things that we're doing right now to try and address these priorities. We're looking at social indicators. So what exactly are social indicators? Well, and why are we interested in them? Well, for those of you in that previous session, you saw that what they were doing, the first speaker was doing, was she was surveying people to find their attitudes about certain things. They asked them to rank something on a scale of 1 to 5, whether they agreed or disagreed that this was an important issue or this was a pressing issue. And that's similar to what you do with social indicators. You're trying to gauge their level of awareness or understanding or knowledge, their beliefs, their behaviors about a specific issue. And so in this case, we're looking at it with respect to water quality related issues, like nutrients, phosphorus, nitrogen, and so forth, getting into water and what kind of effects that might have on a receiving body, or in terms of creating hypoxic zones in different parts of the world. Okay? And what kind of activities they might be taking to address either local or global water quality issues. Okay? So we're trying to collect baseline information on that, and then use that information to help inform not only our activities within the state, but activities in other states as well, wherever the researchers are located. And then use that information to help gauge how much progress we're making in achieving those goals in terms of getting to the overall goal of reducing nutrients in the river basin, okay, and improving water quality. So just some examples of social indicators. So let's say one of our goals, like this one here, is to increase awareness of the people in the area, wherever that area may be, within the county, the parish, or the state. Okay, so the outcome that we're trying to achieve, that awareness outcome number one, is increase awareness of relevant technical issues, okay, related to this critical area. So what kind of indicators do we have? Well, we have awareness of the consequences of pollution in water. And what does that mean in terms of water quality? What types of water quality impairments do we have in our community? Okay? So those are the kind of things. So you'd gauge, you'd have a survey and ask their understanding or awareness of these on a scale of 1 to 5, and do that after you do that as a baseline, and then you make an outreach or an education effort over time, working with them in hopes that this is going to move up and that they become more aware this is being a problem, with the idea being that if people are aware this is a problem, they're more likely to support solutions to that problem, which usually involve funding of some source. Okay? Attitudes of individuals in the target audience, you're looking to change those attitudes. Okay? And those, again, those indicators may be their attitude toward water quality issues or willingness to take action to improve water quality. And what you want to see is that improving over time. Okay? What kinds of constraints might there be in terms of social norms or conventions related to that? So, for example, in this case, if you're dealing with farmers, a lot of farmers like to have, in many parts of the country, they don't like to have residue on their fields. And that's an issue because if they have residue on the field in the fall, it helps keep the soil on the fields in the fall, in the winter, in the spring. And so you have a reduction in nutrients that get off of those, that leaves those fields. And so when there's a prevailing attitude that you have to have no residue on those fields, you end up with a lot more soil erosion and a lot more nutrients getting into the river. And so changing that attitude is very important in terms of getting the desired reductions in nutrients. Okay? Increasing organizational capacity in terms of both personnel and funding. And so you'd measure to see, is there increased funding for agencies that Scott works, for example, with NRCS? Do they have more funding available to help support efforts to reduce nutrient loss? Okay? And then last one I'm going to bring up here is, there's also physical measures that you can take in terms of percentage of the area that's under treatment. So the number of acres that have some kind of a conservation tillage system being implemented, or cover crops being utilized, or a nutrient management plan. So you measure that over time to see if your efforts to educate, to increase awareness and so forth, are having some measured impact on the ground, both in terms of the area and the number of producers that are actually implementing these practices. Okay? Let's see. I got a couple minutes left. So what we've done in the good old tradition of all research scientists, we've come up with a project proposal as a result of this effort in hopes of securing some funding. And we've got some objectives with this specific project. And you can see what those are here. They're basically to help come up with an understanding of efforts that are being undertaken right now in different states to measure some kinds of social indicators. So some states might already be undertaking and doing some kind of initial assessment. It may not be coordinated, but they may be doing some kind of assessments of people within their state in terms of their awareness and attitudes and behavior with respect to nutrients getting into local water systems. Okay, so basically trying to determine what those efforts are in different states, seeing what kind of common elements there might be with those so that we can have perhaps some common questions or set of questions that would be asked across all states once we get a handle on what's going on in the individual states, with the idea that we come up with some kind of a framework, a set of questions that we're going to be asking consistently among a sample of people in each one of those states to get a baseline, then have an outreach campaign over time and measure the impact that that has within those states to see if there's any change in attitude, any change in behavior, any change in actual acres being treated and number of producers actually using those over time. Okay? And so at the end of this, we hope to have a series of assessments of across those states using this kind of a framework, and then obviously write up a report on that. But the overall goal is to hopefully, through doing this, have an impact on the water quality in the Mississippi River Basin. And this is just, as I said before, this is one example of one of the priorities of about, I think there's about 20 of them total under those three broad categories that the Sarah 46 project is looking at. So with that, I want to thank you, and have any questions? We'll be having a little panel in about 20 minutes when Scott's done. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. John, that was great. Our next speaker is Scott Edwards. So a lot of this issue is an agricultural issue, and it'd be great to hear from an agronomist on this, and that's Scott. Scott got his master's degree at Stephen F. Austin University in Texas, and now he is the assistant state conservationist for the USDA located up in Alexandria. So Scott, please take it away.
Thank you. I work for the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is an agency under the USDA that's charged with working with private landowners. Slogan, helping people help the land. Why is that important for this discussion? 70% of all land is owned by private individuals in the United States. So to make this impact that we're looking for to reduce the hypoxia zone, it's going to take private landowners making the commitment to reduce the nutrients moving off of their fields. So we do that with about 2,800 field offices across the United States. Here in Louisiana, we have 44 field offices at the parish level working in partnership with our soil and water conservation districts, and we have around 200 employees here in the state. So why is it that after 80 years of dealing with this issue, a concentrated issue with both technical assistance and financial assistance, are we still having this problem? Estimates of almost 2 billion tons of soil loss per year still happening. The hypoxia zone, we've heard it's increased since the 60s. We've got over 40,000 water bodies that are listed on the 303D list by the EPA, saying that they're impaired for one or more measures. So there's a couple of reasons that I want to propose as to why we still are facing this problem today. One is our model of conservation delivery, and the goal has been here, if we put enough conservation on the ground anywhere on the landscape, eventually we're going to build up to the capacity that will reduce these issues coming off the farm. Our chief back in 2005, Bruce Knight, said these are random acts of conservation. We believe in the voluntary implementation of conservation. And that means that any person can come into our office, it's a private landowner, and sign up, whether it's cropland, forest, pasture land, any issue that they're facing, then we are charged with helping them both technically and financially. A second reason I'm going to give you, water quality work is hard. It's just hard. It's a private individual, it's a business that is charged with taking a natural landscape and converting it to something that will grow crops and fiber for us. And all of the issues that happen with climate and severe rain one year, drought the next, issues, fluctuation, market demands, all of those issues are being built in, and then we're asking private landowners to make the investment in conservation that may not have a one-to-one relationship. Every dollar invested is going to give you that return. They've got to have that conservation ethic, the social indicators that you spoke about earlier. So, as an agency, we were faced with one or two directions. One is to continue down the same path or really take a bold and innovative approach at trying to address water quality across the United States. So I'm teaming this targeted conservation delivery. And where this is going is if you have any landscape that's over here business as usual and you have an impaired stream indicated here by the red, if we deliver our programs as usual, meaning money is set up by state, by county, or by parish, and producers come in. You might have a producer here that comes in and signs up. You might have a cropland here, a pasture here. We're still getting conservation, and we're making a difference at that point on that producer's property. But if we're wanting to make an impact on something downstream like water quality, then you've got to take this targeted approach where you set up issues that I'm going to talk about today: program funding, conservation delivery, outreach, producer involvement, and you concentrate those in this area immediately above the area that's impaired. And so by doing that, it takes us, and we have to constrain ourselves to set up our policy and the way we deliver our programs to meet that need more than just the possible random acts of conservation. So targeted conservation, that's I'm going to today about two different major initiatives that we have that are within the Mississippi River Basin that's addressing this, but it's a proactive landscape level identification and treatment of critical areas. So beyond just the private landowners or the agency expertise, it's everybody that we've heard about today. It's everyone coming together to identify those areas and then trying to make the amount of conservation in that targeted approach to make a difference. So the agency did listen, and we said we're going to take a major amount of our funding each year, and we're going to target it directly to water quality. So we have eight different initiatives that were set up to address water quality. The Chesapeake Bay, that's probably the one that's been going the longest and has had the most funding and targeted approach that's going into that. But about 6 years ago, following a hypoxia meeting, our chief, Dave White, said, okay, there's not any dedicated funding to this issue. There's nobody, we're taking pieces and we're trying, and each state's left with their plan to do that. But as a federal agency, we're going to come in and create the Mississippi River Basin Initiative. The other one I want to talk about today is the national water quality. But any initiative that we have, you've got to target funding, the conservation of treatment. Out of the hundreds of conservation practices that we can implement, you've got to drill down to just those that are going to impact water quality. You got to have producers participating. We also need our partners at EPA and the Department of Environmental Quality to do the monitoring to show the impact that we're having, and then working with everybody to form those partnerships. So the first one is NWQI. I'm with the federal government. I have to use acronyms or my pay gets docked. So that's the National Water Quality Initiative. This is a national initiative. So all 50 states were charged 4 years ago to take 5% of their total funding for conservation and put it towards water quality. So it had to be a list that was on that watershed that was on that impaired list. or threatened or having serious issues. And the three things we were trying to address initially were nutrients and sediment. Those were the two big things that we were working with. Pathogens was new starting in 2013. This map's difficult to see from where you're at, but this is just showing that it's 50 states plus Puerto Rico. Every state you had to do at least one watershed. You could do up to 12 if you had a series of small watersheds connected together. So this was rolled out. This is the current list of fiscal year 15 watersheds. Louisiana, we have 3 watersheds. I'm going to highlight one of the projects that we've been working on here. But just progress through this initiative over the 4th year, we've invested over $85 million in those watersheds. And a watershed meaning the typical size is about 20,000 acres. So it's the smallest watershed size that we work with across the nation. The chief, Jason Weller, has made a commitment of $25 million a year to go to this initiative over the next 3 years. So there's continued investment in over 174 watersheds. So this is some of the things, 750 agreements with landowners. That means that they are actively in a contract with us to implement the conservation, receive cost share assistance, financial assistance, but to maintain those practices long term. 82 of them have state-led, it's EPA-funded 319 projects that allows for the monitoring. So edge-of-field monitoring with in-stream monitoring to show the before and after effects. We have new watersheds proposed for 2015 or 16, and we should hear by the end of March if we're going to be able to move forward on those. But just one example of how this can actually come together, just north of, here's New Orleans, Lake Pontchartrain, we have an area that's the Big Creek watershed that had 18 dairies that were operating within that watershed. And the stream was impaired for fecal coliform, that the levels were too high for primary and secondary contact. So there were issues within these small dairies. We went in first with technical assistance. These are the things that we looked at, all the way from how they were managing their milking parlors, all the way down to nutrient management, grazing management. It's a partnership between EPA, Department of Environmental Quality, NRCS, and all the USDA partners, and then the Lake Pontchartrain Foundation. So this was an effort to go in, identify, and work within this watershed. So over a 3-year period, the Department of Environmental Quality, this is a list of all of their sampling sites that you can see here maybe by the green dots. Just sampling within every event after, they were sampling twice a month and then once after a significant rainfall event that caused runoff. And so in the early parts of this program, every one of these subsections of the 15 or so were red, meaning they exceeded the limits. And so as we started implementing practices, about 75% of the dairies, of the 75%, they all did a nutrient management plan, meaning they looked at how they were dealing with their waste and how they were applying it, what they were doing, making ways of improvement there. But they also started taking on sedimentation issues, any erosion they had. So here you see July 13 to 2015, all of these subsegments, except these 2 small ones, were under the threshold, meaning this is a success story. That sometime this summer, for over a year period, samples, 80% of the samples or less, are running clear. So that stream has been restored for both primary and secondary contact. So this is an example of going in and targeting within the yellow line. We have over 115 dairies, I think, in the state, but we're just focusing on them because this was the area that was impaired the most in the Florida parishes of Louisiana. So this is a success story for us of how you can do that targeting. The Mississippi River Basin Initiative ties in perfectly with what we're doing here because that was that effort to work to avoid, control, or trap nutrient runoff, restore and enhance wildlife habitat, because anywhere where you slow or pond water, you're going to create secondary benefits for wildlife, and then maintain ag productivity. We want to work with the farmers so they continue to produce, but to do it in a sustainable way. So this is the second phase, MRBI, Mississippi River Basin Initiative 2.0. The first set were 4-year projects, partner-driven. Those have all been completed, and now we're moving into our next phase, which includes 13 states. It's the same 12 you mentioned, except for this one small part of South Dakota that they make kind of a direct connection, kind of like in the Ohio Basin. Each state was charged with selecting their basins, their 8-digit HUC watersheds, and those are permanent, and then within that, over the next 4 years, you're going to work within these 12-digit level HUCs. So 62 watershed projects with over $100 million a year going to be invested this year and then 3 years beyond. For Louisiana, we have 8 projects that I'm going to kind of show you on a map where they're at, what we're doing, and then kind of drill down and tell you about the how, why water quality is hard, but some of the things we're doing to overcome it. So all of ours are in the Ouachita River Basin. That was identified in Louisiana Nutrient Management Strategy as one of the hot areas in the state. So that was one of the keys for MRBI. You had to be in an area identified in one of these state plans. So it's a larger connection to the hypoxia issue. We're going to get about $3.6 million over the next 3 years to focus on those practices. 2 big kind of goals, overarching goals that we have, and you mentioned this earlier, reducing fall tillage. Once the crop is harvested, we need something on that ground instead of leaving it bare from September all the way to March. And so the issues of cover crops and tillage management, trying to get people to address that, and I don't know what the percentage is, but a majority of all of the erosion and nutrient loss that's happening in Louisiana is during those winter months when nothing's growing in that barren fallow season. The other thing we want to do is nutrient management techniques. Every producer, every landowner, every homeowner, even if you're in a condo, the people managing your yard have a nutrient management strategy. Either we buy enough and we put it out and we let it run off, or we try to manage and be more efficient with it. Every producer at a much larger scale is somewhere on this level, are they at the very basic or are they at the very highest? The one goal of this is that for every producer we're working with, to move them up one level of nutrient management, make some efficiency gain in their nutrient management on their farm. So these are the 8 projects. They're all concentrated in the northeastern part of the state. You can see some are long and narrow that stay within, a half a mile of the main stream that's impaired. Others are the, larger areas. It does not matter. $3.8 million over 3 years is not going to be enough money to treat every acre within these watersheds. So what we've got to do is drill down even further and get more targeted. This is the base that we start with, and working with a local watershed implementation team, we drill down into these areas. So to show you this, we're going to go in the very northeastern corner of the state in Lake Providence. And this is the lake, there's the community. You can see, okay, is it 5 minutes? And the red line is the outside boundary. This is 34,953 acres. In this particular watershed, 31,000 of them are cropland. So even if when you take out the town, you take out the lake, you're still, a high percentage is cropland. It's a drinking water supply, it's a recreation lake, there's, people, it's a visible, water quality is another thing, it's very difficult to see sometimes. Talking to a farmer in Minnesota about a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, it's difficult sometimes to make that connection. One good thing about this is the Mississippi River as it's running here on the edge, but seeing this lake fill up with sediment and then the nutrient problems and having the blooms that show up, it's a real connection. But this is still too large of an area. This is the common land units. This just means that every yellow delineated area is a crop field owned and operated by somebody in this area. So again, this just goes to show you that over 90% is cropland. There's about 35 producers that are within this area. So what we did, you have to identify critical acres needing treatment. So if you go on the northern edge of this watershed, here's the lake, here's the town, there's a drainage canal that moves in this direction. The working team and working with the Department of Environmental Quality, we feel like the biggest threat to the water quality of the lake and then ultimately as it starts out into the headwaters of I think it's the Tensas River, is going to be the impact coming from these farms. So identifying the critical acres, anybody within the watershed boundary is eligible to sign up for the programs, but then you get bonus points in the ranking if you're in that focus area. But even having this down to 16 producers is not going to be enough to get to our targeted area. So we had to develop a targeted watershed outreach plan. Instead of voluntarily allowing everybody to come in and sign up, we've got to go down to the level of the farm, and we rank them on a scale of 1 to 10 with their involvement with the agency, with our field office. Are they familiar with our programs? Are they familiar with what we do? And we rank them. Then we gave an estimate of what kind of conservation practices are going to be needed. We talked a lot about the social indicators, and what was the term in the previous talk about having that one person that they're going to listen to? Can't remember what the term she used.
Cognitive theory. Cultural.
A voucher, that's it. Having that person, so it may not always be us. It may not always be an RCS. It may be their banker. It may be their lawyer. It may be another farmer. And so identifying, basing these groups in the bottom tier, medium tier, and higher tier, these are just that are familiar with the program, but who do they listen to? Is it a crop consultant, LSU Ag Center? They've come in and made a watershed team, and the plan is to reach each person individually. But then, and this is the last part of the presentation, so now we've identified an area, we know there's a critical need, we've identified the people, but how do we help them, help the land to increase water quality? And so it's focused conservation planning. It's putting the right system on the right place on their farm in the right amount and doing it when you need to do it. And so that is an individual technical assistance from agronomists and foresters and economists going out and helping that producer make those decisions to put the right conservation on the ground. And these are some of the systems that we do. We've divided them into avoiding, controlling, and trapping. So avoiding means don't lose them in the first place. Have the best utilization of your nutrients. So again, right rate, timing, form, method. Have the plant utilize the amount of fertilizer to maximize yield. Don't leave any laying in the field that's going to be able to be washed off in a storm. Controlling are things that you can do with your management of tillage. Instead of plowing every day, recreational tillage, leave some of that residue on the field. Have plans to develop your drainage management. And then finally, if you've done those two, a third backup is to have the trapping. That's the edge of field. So if you have cropland coming, you put a buffer. So if anything does leave, sediment or nutrients, it's going to go through a filter. Or you have a constructed wetland that takes all of that water, get it off the field for production purposes, but then trap it, filter it, and then let it go into the receiving waters. Even to a point, and they've done this in the northern part of this river basin, are two-stage ditches. Even taking the management of the way we convey water off of the farm to put more science into that and engineering and figure out a way, again, to slow, trap, and scrub that water before it moves on. So that total approach with targeted funding, but then getting to the point of identifying the most critical need on the landscape, reaching the producers, but then delivering the science-based technical assistance with our voluntary incentive-based approach, we feel like we've got a good plan moving forward over the next 5 years. Yeah, done.
Well, thank you, Scott. That was a great talk. We've got time for a little bit of a discussion. I'll maybe start this off with just. I think you guys can just stay where you are. We'll have a discussion around the room. And this is a question for John more than anyone else. So, but as much, why does the problem not pay for itself? Pay for the solution? And I'll add, my question is, we're sending, about, 1.5 million, 2 million metric tons a year of nitrogen down the Mississippi River. That goes, nitrogen, fertilizer's about, I don't know, it's like $400, I just looked it up, it's like $400 a metric ton. So you do the math, that's $600 million a year. Let's say some of that's natural, let's call it $500 million a year, is coming down the Mississippi River. Why are farmers not under their own incentive to hold that $500 million a year of nitrogen on their land?
That's a very good question, and, I think following up on what Scott talked about in terms of nitrogen and/or phosphorus utilization by the plants, farmers have an idea of what kind of yield they're going to get, whatever crop they're growing, based on the amount of fertilizer that they're going to apply. And the amount of crop that they harvest times the price that they're going to get determines how much income they're going to get. And so if you can get high yield by putting on a certain amount of fertilizer, and maybe the plant will use half of that, maybe it'll use 75% of that. But if you don't put that fertilizer, and it's all dependent on, as Scott mentioned, the weather and rainfall and sunshine and all those things. But if you have this idea of how much you're going to get for yield, and it requires you to put on, let's say, 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre, okay? But it's possible to get that same yield if you were more efficient by putting on 150 pounds, but you don't know, because you don't know what the weather's going to be like, and you don't know if by putting it on the next day or 2 days later it's going to rain and a quarter of that fertilizer gets washed off the field. What they essentially end up doing is putting on enough to get that expected yield, and oftentimes that's more than is actually utilized by the plant, and so that's when you get fertilizer running off the field. I mean, there's a lot of things that go on. It's not like a factory. There's a lot of uncertainty in farming, and so they put on what they think the plants will need to get that yield that they're looking for.
And basically, the price of the plant is worth more than the price of the crop is worth more than the lost fertilizer.
Right. Unfortunately, that's the reality. Is it's cheap insurance to put fertilizer on. It's cheaper than the potential yield loss.
Okay. Are there other questions? Do people? Yeah.
So I'm thinking we have a bunch of excess fertilizer flowing down the Mississippi. Do you have any thoughts of how that could be recaptured and maybe put in the wetlands? You mentioned trapping, and sometimes wetlands are constructed to capture the nutrients. Do you have any thoughts about how that might be done?
Doug, that kind of sounds like a question for you, I think.
No, any of us could, but I mean, it is being done, at different places. The question of scale comes up. For the problem in the Gulf, and you've got this huge river basin, you can do things at a scale. For instance, if you reconnected a large part of the floodplain somewhere in the basin and slowed down the water and it was going through swamps or something, that could really help. At the edge of fields, they're certainly doing that in different places. No particular farm, we don't know how many, in terms of the Gulf Dead Zone, nobody knows how much any particular farm or even a lot of watersheds need to reduce. We just know that any reductions that they achieve will help, and the more that are achieved, the bigger effect there'll be. For local impairments of local streams or lakes, those edge of field trap and process the nutrients, you do have a really good idea of what you need to try to do on that individual field basis. But for this really big system, we don't really know, but that's actually an advantage because it gives us lots of different things we could do across that Mississippi River Basin landscape that don't have to be measured with a whole lot of precision in terms, again, of the Gulf of Mexico. If you have a local impairment that you're trying to deal with, you do want to get a lot more precision. So I hope that made sense. I mean, yes, all those things can help. And Scott mentioned the ditches. Down here in the south, the open ditch drainage, there's been work done to show that if you slow that water down, you can hold it. Because of our climate, a lot of nutrients get processed in the ditch, and then if you run that through a wetland, that even adds to it, so you can take care of a lot of the problem that way. You just got to have the resources to help folks do that at the scale that will have that basin-wide impact.
We get to. Are there other questions? Yeah.
Well, I was just wondering what your thoughts are farm bill and agricultural subsidies kind of contribute to those incentives for farmers to maybe put on more fertilizer than is necessary, and how that could maybe be changed to help reduce the problem.
Sure. So that's basically, are we subsidizing the dead zone? Is that effectively your question?
Pretty much.
Do we have an
Well, one thing that's...
Let's let the non-federal employee answer that question.
Right. It's an interesting question, and, there's been a lot of research that's been done that's looked at that kind of perverse incentive where you're incentivizing producers to get, the market is incentivizing producers to get the maximum yield. That's apparent. But you also have maybe producers growing crops on land that isn't necessarily best suited for that particular activity. Maybe it's marginal land, and because of those programs, they may be growing those crops like corn, for example, on areas that may not be, they may be better suited for other commodities or just pasture for that matter. And so, there's research that shows that does happen. One thing, though, I was going to mention, and this is, I know there have been some, it's kind of an experimental program that they've been doing in some states, and it's not very widely utilized, but it's kind of an insurance program where a farmer, if they agree to, on some part of their field, or some, fields that they've got, apply a reduced rate that is supposed to get under, regular conditions that they might experience in a given year, give them a yield that's at what they're expecting it to be, whatever that may be, 150, 200 bushels of corn per acre, whatever it may be. But they apply a more judicious amount, let's say, a more measured amount. They do that on some of their fields, and then they do whatever the recommended rate is on the rest of their field. Well, if that other field that they're applying this lower rate at doesn't achieve that yield that the other is going to get, they get paid the difference in terms of, if it's 10 bushels per acre, they get paid that difference. If it gets that yield, they don't get anything. So it's kind of an insurance program. It's experimental, but it's designed to help reduce the amount of fertilizers that are applied to fields that, they might otherwise apply a higher level of nutrients.
So one other thing to mention is in the Farm Bill, the conservation title has provisions to take the marginal cropland, those areas they should be farming, into a retirement to restore back to its natural state. The other thing in this new Farm Bill, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program is asking for private industry and partners to match our federal investment. So you have groups like USA Rice and Ducks Unlimited that are doing a nutrient management project here in the state to reduce nitrogen inputs, to then hopefully match the yields, but then the makeup and the difference in yield that could potentially be there may be made up of winter water holding and the ability for wildlife habitat and having that kind of thing. So with this new program in the Farm Bill, we're asking industry and other partners to help us innovate the way we're delivering conservation.
And just broadly speaking, we're thinking on this basin scale, that you're going to need to mitigate. There has been it's a perverse incentive, but it's also a cause and effect. No one wants to cause the dead zone, but we know that it's a direct effect of a lot of acres going into production for corn and biofuels. And so when those initiatives are going through, they should have really included a mitigation component that was a lot more ambitious. That was one of the failings of this task force. They didn't want to touch it for obvious reasons. A lot of these states really wanted that. But it wasn't a matter of telling people, no, you can't produce biofuels. It's like, okay, this is going through whether or not it's a good idea. Let's have a mitigation component attached to this, because we know it's going to have impacts. They dropped the ball. They didn't do it. The new Farm Bill has some very helpful stuff in it, but going forward, there's a lot more we can do.
All right, well, going forward, I think we've got more of the conference in front of us. So I think that this has been a great discussion. Let's thank our speakers. And And probably just as importantly, let's thank you guys, because you guys asked great questions, so thank you all for coming.